Hi, everybody. I'm Jan Gartner, the Compensation and Staffing Practices Manager in the Office of Church Staff Finances, and I'm delighted to be here with my teammates, Sean and Richard. We've been rethinking the UUA salary recommendations for a while now, and it feels really good. And as some of you know, I've been paying attention to professional challenges and issues for quite some time. I was a religious educator in a large congregation and then a small one in my area in Rochester, New York. I've been a Loretta Good Officer and a mentor in the RE credentialing program. I was on regional staff for a year, district staff as it was known then, and then moved to the UUA in 2011 into the professional development office and into church staff finances in 2016. So I've had a lot of vantage points on staff compensation and other staff issues. So that's just a little bit about me. Sean, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. There we go. Sorry, I'm doing the tech side of our presentation today too. Good afternoon, all. I think it is afternoon wherever you are in the country by now. My name is Sean Griffin, he, him, his. I am the compensation and benefits specialist here with the compensation team in the Office of Church Staff Finances. I joined the UUA at the beginning of the year. After serving for a couple of years as the administrator for a mid-sized congregation. Prior to that, I spent more than 20 years working in the performing arts, backstage and as an administrator, primarily in the theater world, where I handled a variety of business and HR and budgeting and other issues. So I've been involved in HR and compensation in the nonprofit environment for several decades at this point. I live now in Indianapolis, Indiana, relocated here over the summer. And that's a little bit about me. And then I'm also pleased to introduce the head of the Office of Church Staff Finance, if you're not familiar, Richard Nugent. Richard?
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Jan. Yeah, hi, I'm Richard Nugent, and I am a Unitarian Universalist minister, just celebrated my 25th year of ordination at Ministry Days this year. I've been in my current position for 15 years, 14 years, I'm in my 15th year. And of course, in addition to compensation, we have the retirement plan and all the insurance products as well as aid funds. And before taking this position in 2008, I served 11 years at 7 congregations over the course of 11 years as an interim minister. I did my first interim when I just got out of seminary, and I fell in love with interim ministry. And before all that, I lived 2 years in Indonesia. And before all that, I spent 22 years doing public policy in Washington, D.C., which continues to be my home. I worked in the Senate, I lobbied the Congress, and I was a political consultant. So I am more than happy to admit, as you can hear sirens probably nearby, urban life. I'm an unrepentant policy wonk who has ministerial credentials. So somewhere between all that. So thanks for all joining today.
Thank you. I think I'm now unmuted. Yeah. We're here to talk with you today about rethinking the UUA salary recommendations. We see that we have both an opportunity and an obligation to improve practicality, advance equity, and lead with greater integrity. And I will circle back to all of that at the end. We'll do a presentation for you. It's about half an hour, and then we'll have some conversation. And so I want to start with some history and context. And the context of our office is this mission. Guided by the values of our faith, we equip congregations for excellence as employers and their staff for financial competence and well-being. The work that we do on compensation guidance it speaks to all pieces of this mission. It is part of our faith and our values. It is equipping congregations for excellence, and it's helping our staff with their well-being. And we want to remind you that that's not all we do. Our salary recommendations have been a prominent piece of our work, but they are part of a much bigger bucket of resources and guidance that we offer to congregations as employers. I want to say a word about why we provide salary recommendations. Certainly, I would say a big main point is to promote economic justice. We want to equip congregations for excellence as employers. Remember, that's our mission. We help congregations attract and retain quality staff. We're aiding congregational decision-making. And because we are an association of congregations, we want to be creating consistent expectations across congregations. So we don't have every congregation making up their own system. To give you a very quick history of the compensation program, you might or might not know that before 1995, there was no compensation guidance provided by the UUA, at least not in any formal way. So I like to think about who did that work well for? Well, it worked best for people who have power within their congregational systems. It works well for people with good negotiating skills. And I would say in general, a system, it would work well for people who have identities who tend to be centered and regarded in our society, as opposed to those that tend to be more marginalized. All of those things are still true, that certain people have natural advantages in negotiating for their pay, which is one reason that the UUA feels it's important for us to provide some guidance on this front. In 1995, after a 5-year study that included surveys and consultants and all kinds of research, the Fair Compensation Program was adopted at General Assembly. And then what happened after that? Well, largely what happened after 1995 was that we added what I call granularity or specifics. Over time, we went from 8 jobs to 26 jobs. We went from 5 congregational sizes to 6 sizes. There were other ways that we tightened things up and made them more specific. And yet overall, the methodology stayed about the same. We've basically had the same approach since 1995. That's 27 years ago. A couple things that began to move a few years ago. In 2017, we began to put a greater emphasis on legal compliance. We realized with all of the wonderful talk about UUA guidelines and recommendations, there were actual legal must-dos that were getting lost. This is largely around benefits, but also in the way of worker classification and payroll. So we started to put more resource energy toward legal pieces. And then around 2020, we began to offer process guidance. I will say more about that later. And we wanted to really be more intentional about taking a look at our methodology. So here we are, 2022, and we took inspiration from a couple of sources, largely from the UUA's own journey with hiring practices for UUA staff over the past few years, as well as from the Commission on Institutional Change report, Widening the Circle of Concern. Both of those speak to all the different ways that congregations can be equitable and inclusive in their approach to taking care of their staff. You might also wonder, in terms of sources of inspiration, did we look at other denominations. And yes, we did do that. We discovered that most denominations, they only provide information for clergy. And they do that in a couple of ways. One is very simply to suggest benchmark jobs in the community. For instance, there's a denomination that suggests looking at the pay of the local high school principal as a benchmark for the pay for your minister. We've also seen a few different versions of a chart or a formula that's based on 2 or 3 factors. Perhaps there's a base pay, and then you add on to that depending on the size of the congregation, and then there's another factor where you would add on for years of experience. All of this is to say that the UUA offers almost, and there is an exception, but almost the most elaborate compensation guidance we've seen among religious organizations. And I do not say that to make a judgment on any one way of doing it. It is, though, a reflection on what we value. We think it's important to take care of all staff, not just clergy. We think it's important to provide as much information as we can. So we tend to go kind of very deep and specific and offer many different details to help people fine tune. Not a bad thing. It's just quite a different approach from most denominations. One thing that other denominations have often done more effectively than we have is to compile and report actual salaries from their member congregations. And that's something that has been hard for us to do. And we finally did a compensation and staffing survey in May and early June of this year. And Sean will be telling you a little bit about that in a few minutes. One reason that we're revisiting is not just because it's been 27 years and it seems like maybe we should look at it again, but because we're recognizing some of the challenges of the current system. Certainly some of those have to do with, they just feel less practical. There are many more unique jobs emerging in congregations, duties that evolve, different leadership models that are really hard to work with in our current salary recommendation system. On the equity front, I'd particularly like to lift up cultural wage biases. Our salary recommendations are based on national wage surveys, and we probably all agree that in this country, jobs that have been traditionally held by women and jobs that are often held by those with marginalized identities tend to get undervalued relative to jobs that are more typically held by men and perhaps white men in particular. And so that means there are biases embedded in those national wage surveys that we are perpetuating through our own salary recommendations. And we think we can do something about that. On the integrity, in the integrity arena, I want to focus on right now on the illusion of precision, by which I mean, we talked about how we keep getting more fine-tuned. We add jobs, we make our sizes tighter, and we add geo indices. So there are more little pieces that we try to take into account. But in the end, we're not convinced that that level of detail is useful or meaningful, or that it's necessarily leading to better outcomes in congregations. So we're taking another look at our level of specificity. Finally, it is somewhat outside of the scope of this presentation, but of course I'd be remiss not to say something about economic challenges, economic sustainability of our congregations and of congregational staff in our professions. We don't necessarily think we can fix that by changing the way we offer our recommendations, but certainly we want to name it as part of our current challenging arena that we find ourselves in. So that's a little setup. Now I'm going to move into the nuts and bolts of what we're doing here with some concepts and new directions. The first concept has to do with two different types of justice. The first is distributive justice, and that's about the amount of pay given to employees, and that involves numbers and tables and formulas. And then there's procedural justice, and that has to do with the process used to make and implement pay decisions. That involves things like policies that are equitable and transparent, decision-making practices, checking for bias. They're both important, and they're both aspects of overall economic justice. We want to be leading with procedural justice, and that's gotten shortchanged somewhat over the years because people are very focused on the tables, the numbers. So we want to be providing process guidance for congregations. We actually already do that. And we have a page with some basic information. We also have a guide to our salary recommendations that's essentially process guidance. And yet we could do much better. We could do much better to make that feel like the main thing that we can offer. Help with how decisions get made and how to be equitable and transparent with your employees. One example might be, does the congregation post salaries on all of their job openings? That's a procedural point. It doesn't have to do with any individual's amount of pay. Certainly reviewing salaries for bias, paying attention to things like the living wage and cost of living increases. These are all process examples, and we want to do better to get those out in front of people. What we discovered when we surveyed in April to see how people were using our current guidance is that of the congregations who responded, about 90% are making use of the UUA salary tables. For some, it's their only source of information. For others, it is a main source of information. Meanwhile, only about 9% knew about and made use of our process guidance. And it's newer, we recognize that. And yet it just seems like such a huge disparity given the importance of process. So big message here, process should be primary. Moving on to the next concept, salary structure by jobs or grades. Right now we have these job-based recommendations. They're based on job titles and responsibilities in functional areas. Now what the UUA uses and what some of you may be familiar with from other concepts is grade-based recommendations. So my job is given a grade, and I have the same grade as a number of other UUA staff who have very different specific jobs than mine are. The grades are about level of skills and knowledge, things like authority and accountability. So they look pretty different in a way, but they're all based on wage data. They all use ranges to account for experience and or performance. So again, currently we're using a job-based structure with 26 different job titles, and we get requests every year to add more. And we are shifting to a grade-based structure with 6 job levels. And I have started a grade rubric that outlines what we mean by each of those job levels. And I'm going to come back to all this. I'll put it all together a little later. The next concept has to do with comparisons. What feels fair to you as an employee when you're thinking about how much you're paid? One piece of that is about external alignment. Is my pay competitive, you might ask, with similar jobs in the world or in my locality or in my industry? I have a son who lives in Silicon Valley and works for Apple, and he is thinking about, is his pay competitive with what he would make if he had a similar job at Google, for instance? That's external alignment. Here's a very different question. Is my pay equitable relative to other staff in my congregation? And the answer to that question might be very different, one way or another. I can tell you that pretty much everybody is interested in internal alignment. They want to know that their salary makes sense relative to those of the people they work with. That's a way of feeling like their pay is fair. Somewhere in the middle between internal and external is what I call UU market alignment. Again, this is thinking about our congregations as an association, and there's a relationship among them. So is my pay consistent with similar jobs in similar UU congregations? And that also might be important to certain people. So people value these three kinds of alignment differently depending on their situations, with internal alignment tending to be prioritized by pretty much everyone. This leads me to a distinction that we really have not made in the past. It's not a perfect dichotomy, but it's something that we feel deserves recognition. And that's the distinction between career path and community-based jobs. What I mean by career path is that the equivalent work is mainly found in UU congregations. That's where you would have more potential for UU career progression, and there'd be more likelihood to view their work as a vocation, people in career path positions. And that's compared with or contrasted with community-based positions, where the most equivalent work is mainly outside of Unitarian Universalism. These are people who would tend to have more potential for local job opportunities and are more likely to be attentive to the job market in their area. And I want to talk about how this fits in with those types of alignment. The career path people, again, internal alignment, always a good thing. Does my pay make sense relative to the people on my team? But those people are also paying attention to the UU market. What are other congregations paying for similar work? Whereas those in community-based jobs, again, internal alignment, yes, but might tend to prioritize external alignment. What could they get for similar work in their community or industry? And the reason this comes into play is that we're realizing that the best use of our energy, what makes the most sense, is for us to focus mainly on career path positions when we're looking at our salary, at creating salary bands. Because for the community-based position, we believe that usually local wage comparisons are more appropriate, and we can certainly direct congregational leaders to general sources of information about wages in their community to particular jobs. Again, this is not an exact position. We were talking the other day about musicians in particular can fall on both sides of the equation. But it's something to consider when I introduce our new directions, that we're really thinking about the career path positions primarily. I get to stop talking for a minute and let Sean take over for a sec to tell you a little more about the compensation and staffing survey I mentioned.
Sure, thanks, Jan. We realized, or actually when I was brought on to the Office of Church Staff Finance, one of the primary goals was to develop an understanding of what were compensation and staffing practices, actual practices among congregations across the association. And we hadn't asked, the UUA had not asked this question since 2010. So we developed and released in the spring a compensation and staffing survey, the goal of collecting that information from at least 200 congregations. We were thrilled that we actually collected information from 350 congregations, and that represented more than 50% of congregations in all of the different size ranges except for the small congregations. We were actually not particularly surprised about that because we know also that a number of the small congregations don't have any staff at all. So this ended up being a very representative sample across all the different size ranges. From that, there were a total of 2,150 individual positions that were submitted in the survey. And of those positions, we were able to match 1,680 to existing UUA recommendations. So that ended up being about 78%. Interestingly, one of the immediate things that this also told us about our existing salary recommendations is those 470 positions, or 22%, that were not able to match. And we had an understanding that there was a lot of staffing decisions being made in new and innovative ways in congregations, a lot of combined responsibilities. For example, someone who might have responsibility for both membership and communications is something that we saw a good bit of in the survey. But that was a really good indication that we really desperately needed a rethink of how we recommended salary and compensation. So we've learned a couple of things from the data so far. There's an awful lot of work still to be done. So we have a couple of general early results. And one of them is that the vast majority, in the survey data, it's literally about 70% of all reported positions are part-time workers. In the survey data, that's actually over 82% for the smallest congregations, and gets down to an even 50-50 for the largest. Now, we put a sort of an asterisk on that, at least verbally I've done that, because we think that that number of part-time employees may actually be higher based on that a number of congregations would simply submit once for their part-time workers. For example, they may have 6 or 8 or more childcare workers for Sunday services, but they only submitted that once. So we think that percentage is actually even a little more heavily weighted towards part-time workers. What we also discovered is that when we looked at all 1,680 positions across, so all of the responses, and compared them to the median salary for those responses, there's actually only about a 1% variance across everything. So what that also told us is that the people are paying attention, and the existing UUA salary recommendations are, in the broadest sense, being integrated into actual congregational practices. And there is a lot of nuance to that data. These, like I said, are the very high level, big picture kind of results. As we begin to look at more closely the information by particular position or by size, by geo-index, there's a lot more variety and a lot more nuance. And we are looking forward to seeing how that influences or informs this salary rethink. Knowing what the actual practices are among the association is one part. It's an important part, but it is just one part of our overall resources for developing these new standards of recommendation. Now, Jan is going to pick that back up to talk about what those standards are and more about putting a larger lens on what the salary rethink is all about. So Jan, we'll turn it back to you.
All right. Okay, I am now unmuted again. Yeah, we now, just as of this spring, actually have 3 sources of information to guide us in creating the next generation of recommended salary bands. Certainly, we have the current salary tables. We're starting from where we are, taking into account what we've been recommending all along. It is not our intent to make gigantic shifts in any particular position. We have market data. We collect this every year or two for a variety of church and nonprofit positions. That's that national wage data that I referred to earlier. So we will continue our benchmarking that way. And then our compensation and staffing survey results. What's going to happen is we're going to discover that those don't all line up perfectly. The market data and our current salary tables have never been easy to line up to start with because of the way the information we get from the market data. It doesn't come in the same little size buckets that we've created. So we've always had to do a little smushing to make things line up. And now with our staffing and survey results, that'll be one more resource, and our compensation advisor is going to help us come up with a reasonable way forward, taking into account all three of those sources. You might be wondering about size and geo-index. I'm going to talk about size first. This is probably, in a way, the biggest shift. We have had 6 size categories, and we're reducing that to 4 categories. We want to make them feel more meaningful relative to congregational functioning and the way staff operate within their congregations. We're going to continue to use membership as a main metric. People kind of have a feel for it, right? If you talk about a 120 member congregation or a 600 member congregation, there's a picture that people have of what that looks like. At the same time, membership is by no means, it's one number in your congregation, and it's not a complete description. And so we're going to flesh out the membership information with a budget and a couple of other types of descriptors of the different size profiles. And this is new. We're going to make them overlap a bit. So it's always been the case that 249 and 250, it's not that some remarkable thing happens as you cross that threshold with one more member. And yet that's put people in a whole new category. And we want to be a little bit more nuanced than that. So we're going to have some overlaps so that congregations have an opportunity to decide which size makes sense for them. What about the geo index? This is a really interesting one. We get a lot of people who write and say, why are we a 4, but one town over is a 3 or a 5? And what I can tell you is that, again, kind of like with the membership number, there's no single perfect number to describe your congregation when it comes to wages paid. But I believe most of you know that the geo index is a single number that reflects how the level of wages paid in your community in general relative to the national average. I'm in Rochester, New York. We're a 3. A 3 means that the congregation is in an area that pays within 3% of the national average. 2 and 1 are lower, 4 to 7 are larger. They do not directly take into account the cost of living in a given area. So we have a few places where the cost of living is very high, but wages paid aren't necessarily in keeping with that. We know it's problematic, and yet it's an okay system. We're getting our information from the Economic Research Institute, which tracks wages for many, many jobs across the country. And we haven't honestly thought of a better way of doing it. So we're leaving it alone for now. And please, as a reminder, on our geo index listing, we do also have cost of living information for the various locations. So if you're in a place that's a geo index 4, but the cost of living is way, way, way above the national average, that's certainly something that your congregation needs to wrestle with in their hiring. Going back to all the different pieces I talked about, we are moving from, here's the proposed new structure is we'll have 4 size profiles rather than 6 size categories. We'll have 6 job levels instead of 26 separate jobs. The ranges will look similar with a minimum and a maximum. We're playing with the idea of, instead of a one exact midpoint, to maybe offer a mid-range or a target range. We'll keep you posted on that. Right now, our congregations use capsule job descriptions. The job title that you are given might not be the exact job title that we use. If you're an administrator, are you a congregational administrator? Are you an office administrator? Are you a director of finance and operations? Those capsule job descriptions help the congregation decide which actual job you're in for pay purposes. As we move to the new system, we're going to do the same thing with these job levels. The congregation will be looking at these job level descriptions to place each of their employees at the right level with respect to this new pay structure. How about sizes? We're going to also, because it's not going to just be based on a single membership number, we're going to provide size profile descriptions that include typical membership and budget, and perhaps some features of programming and staffing to help congregational leaders decide on their profile. There's one other thing that we haven't been doing that we have decided on, which is we have some jobs. I would say any of those top 3 levels, someone who holds one of those positions might be a minister, or they might not be a minister. They might still be filling that, let's say, that second executive role. And we did a lot of thinking about, if 2 people are doing the same job, one's a minister, one's not, do they necessarily get the same pay? Did a lot of discernment around that. And in the end, we recognized that ministers, they're in a different system. The search system is different. The way there's a high cost of entry into the UU ministry. And I like to say a high cost of exit. If your minister leaves, it's a much bigger process for the congregation to get another minister versus someone who is not a minister who might hold a similar position. For that reason, we feel that there is reason to give some extra consideration to ministers in terms of their pay at each of those levels. However, what I'll say is that right now we have some huge discrepancies in pay between a ministerial role and a non-ministerial role that seem to be at a similar level of functioning. So my expectation is that we will set these tiers, the minister tier versus the business and program tier, to be closer together than what we have now, even though the minister will still have that extra bump in pay. So I hope that makes sense, and we'd be glad to talk about that. That was really the crux of where we're going. So let me just wrap up with a little bit of what's next, and then we can have some conversation. I want to emphasize that the role of the UUA is to equip congregations for excellence as employers. That's truly our mission. We are providing a service to congregations by offering profit process guidance. And remember, we want that to feel like the primary thing, as well as the recommended salary bands. And we are here to be cheerleaders for you and your congregational leaders in making great decisions about compensation for staff and taking good care of staff in all kinds of ways. The role of congregational leaders, and this would include staff who have input into staff salaries. The congregation retains agency. We want to be really clear about that. Our office does intervene at times when we believe that congregations are actually doing something that's illegal. Short of that, in the end, the congregation owns their decisions and policies and practices. We do want everyone to remember that process is primary, We'd like to see people using the UUA information responsibly and sensibly. And please, if you are a supervisor, take good care of your staff in all the ways, right? This is not just about salaries or just about compensation and benefits. This is about supervision, personnel policies. Are staff shown appreciation? Do they have opportunities to learn and grow? All kinds of ways to take great care of staff. Circling back to the very first slide, that practicality piece, the process guidance, because it applies across positions and it's less intricate, it doesn't include all of the separate benefits pieces. We feel like the process guidance improves, making that primary as a way of improving the practicality of what we offer, while the grade system really lends itself to different kinds of staffing arrangements and structures. So that's another way of improving the practicality of our guidance. In terms of equity, the process focus, that's the whole deal with the process focus. It's grounded in equity and transparency as values. And the grades are intended to help emphasize equity within the staff team and mitigate some of those biases we talked about for individual positions that might be undervalued. And leading with integrity, and I want to be clear, I'm talking about our integrity as the UUA. We really feel like the best, the most important and appropriate role for us is values-based. The process pieces are very much grounded in values. And then legal, of course, has to do with ethics. Are you doing what you're legally compelled to do? That is an important part of of us showing integrity in the way that we offer guidance. In terms of the salary bands, another piece of integrity for me is saying we can't tell you exactly for all of your staff positions. We want to acknowledge the limitations and suggest other resources. That's an important piece of showing integrity, being honest about what we can and can't necessarily do well. What's next? We do plan to have this approach in place for the 23-24 cycle. We'll be refreshing and expanding on our process guidance. We plan to post the salary bands in November in this new structure that's in the same timeline that we usually put them up. We're going to keep the current salary tables available. We don't want to all of a sudden leave you without them as a resource because, as you'll see this coming into view, this is not like flicking a switch. This little image is meant to say, it's going to be something we live into. It's going to be a little squishy. Sometimes you're going to be pink and sometimes you're going to be purple. And we're going to all live into this over the next couple of years. We're going to keep sharing and fine tuning. We have certain approvals to get from the UUA, and we're continuing to get buy-ins from various groups. We have a paid compensation advisor from a compensation consulting firm. We're consulting with her a lot on various specifics, as well as with interested parties and people directly involved in specific situations. We're engaging congregational leaders and staff such as yourselves. We're creating resources and communications. There's much more to come. So please stay tuned. Thank you for being with us. We're heading into our time of conversation with questions and feedback. We're going to prioritize people who have questions that are related to moving to this new way of providing salary recommendations. And if we have time and there's no more of those, we can move on and take other questions that you might have about things that we do in the Office of Church Staff Finances.